Okay, let's start. My name is Jeanne Wolff Bernstein, and I'm a psychoanalyst here in Vienna, and also the head of the advisory council here for scientific studies. And it's a great pleasure and really an honor to be part of this conference. And I think you all need some time after this amazing film we just got to see, and also the wonderful lecture we got to hear yesterday night. I'm going to say a little bit about witnessing, and then I will introduce our three participants today. To bear witness, Shoshana Filman writes, is to bear the solitude of a responsibility, and to hear and to bear the responsibility precisely of that solitude. And yet, as Laub and Filman write, to bear witness is an appointment to transgress the confines of that isolated stance, to speak for others and to others. Bearing witness is a term that is essentially untranslatable in its emotional cadence into French or German. In fact, later on, I would love to hear how you translate it into Hebrew. Since the idea of bearing, tolerating, escapes the meaning in its French and German version, since only English makes room for the emotional experience of bearing, of carrying something, and eventually for someone else. In German, you can say Zeugnis ablegen oder Zeugnis leisten, but both verbs imply a working act. Something has to be done, not an emotional experience or bearance. In French, as best as I know, one has only the word témoigner, which is not accompanied by any idea of bearance, of tolerating. On the other hand, in contrast, the German word Zeugen plays upon a double meaning, since it also means creating or siring or producing, siring a child. Implying, if we play now between the different languages, that something creative can be generated out of the process of witnessing, which in turn is one of the themes of today's conference. And one more observation, since we already talked last night about translation and the power and politics involved in languages and their disseminations. The wit in witness refers to mind and denotes the power for seizing on some thought or occurrence. In the English lexicon of Samuel Johnson, wit is defined, and I quote him here, as the powers of the mind, the mental faculties, the intellects, and the quickness of fancy. Thus, the expression of losing one's wits comes much closer to the possibility of losing one's wits in the process of being or becoming a witness to a traumatic experience. Again, a possibility that we will hear about today and also saw just now in the movie when we talk about Dori Laub's later work with Holocaust survivors who had been locked up in psychiatric wards in Israel, often diagnosed as being schizophrenic or psychotic. Now, it is possible that this elasticity in the English language has indirectly led to the fact that it was American psychoanalysts who were among the first, including Dori Laub, to write about the importance of the act of witnessing as a part of the psychoanalytic process. They insisted that the psychoanalyst needed to engage as an active rather than a passive witness in the analytic process, and not just remain a distant and supposedly neutral observer. And what does this mean, active versus passive witnessing? Ghislaine Boulanger, who has also widely written about the process of active witnessing, describes it with the following words. She claims that the analyst needs to be touched by the survivor's experience and be possibly confused by his or her narration. It is therefore not uncommon for analysts working with severely traumatized people to become completely confused, helpless, and often estranged. She writes, survivors of massive psychic trauma frequently experience deficits in symbolic functioning, affecting the capacity to dream and to think productively. Clinicians working with survivors also find themselves stuck thoughtless, unable to reflect on the horrors their patients describe. She argues that experiencing an initial state of incoherence might be a necessary condition of the healing process when analysts work with this population. It is in the struggle to overcome this state and to become thinking professionals again that they can start to bear witness to the patient's experience. And it is through this work with the analyst's containing presence that the survivor ceases to be a mute observer to her own loss and starts to recapture her thinking self and begins the process of witnessing his or her own survival. Now, witnessing is therefore not just a solitary experience, but one that needs an other to hear his or her words and to hear them in front of a third, namely the video camera, the latter being an important element and presence in this process about which we will surely hear about from Amit Pinchevski. Shoshana Fellman, Dori Laub's co-author, argues, I quote her again, that Holocaust testimonies enable survivors for the first time to believe that it is possible, indeed against all odds and against their past experience, to tell the story and to be heard, or also to be seen, as we learned today, to in fact address the significance of their biography, to address, that is, the suffering, the truth, and the necessity of this impossible narration, to a hearing you and to a listening by the community. The victim's narrative, the very process of bearing witness to massive trauma, does indeed begin with someone who testifies to an absence, which is the theme for this year here at the Freud Museum, to an event that has not yet come into existence in spite of the overwhelming and compelling nature of the reality of its occurrence. Now, let me conclude this short introduction into the process of witnessing with one of my absolute favorite quotes by Dori Laub, who wrote in 1992, while historical evidence to the events which constitute the trauma may be abandoned and documents in vast supply, the trauma as a known event and not simply as an overwhelming shock has not been truly witnessed yet, not being taken cognizant of. The emergence of the narrative, which is being listened to and heard, is therefore the process and the place wherein the cognizance, the knowing of the event, is given birth to. The listener is therefore a party to the creation of knowledge de novo. The testimony to the trauma thus includes its hearer, who is, so to speak, the blank screen on which the event comes to be inscribed for the first time. Now I have the tremendous pleasure of introducing to you our three participants. Today we will hear about Dori Laub, and we've already heard and seen him today, the child survivor of the Holocaust, the psychoanalyst, and also the father of video testimony. And again, as Amit Pinchevski writes and will hopefully explain to us later, the one who also introduced the counter archive into the archive. We will hear about Dori Laub, the man who survived the camps with his mother and moved with her and his grandparents to Israel after the war, studying medicine and psychiatry in Tel Aviv, and eventually moving to the US, where he pursued his analytic training and worked at Austin Riggs in Massachusetts. It was during his analytic training that Dori Laub conceptualized the idea of collecting video interviews of other survivors. This project eventually led to the largest collection of video testimonies of Holocaust survivors at the Fortunoff Archive, whose 45th anniversary we're honoring today. Through the memories of Françoise Davoine, who became a close friend of Dori Laub, along with her husband, Jean-Max Godelier, We will receive a very intimate picture into the life of this remarkable man who left an important legacy behind, one that's actually not very well known to most Germans, since there's hardly any book or text of his translated into German, so maybe that eventually will change. Françoise will tell us about her many personal encounters with Dori Laub and also the influence he had upon her work. For instance, the utter necessity for the traumatized person to know who the person is to whom the survivor is talking. Who are you that I am talking to? In such an encounter, there is no space for analytic neutrality. Through her discussions with Dori Laub, Françoise Davoine can shed a light upon the importance of giving testimony to a yet unregistered traumatic event that only comes to be inscribed in the symbolic through the encounter with an active witness within a triadic structure. Much of what Françoise has taken from Dori Laub has come to bear upon the current work we are undertaking with a large group of Ukrainian analysts during monthly meeting, a series entitled Working Under Conditions of War, which is organized by the Freud Museum here. I don't think that there has been one meeting where Dori Laub's name was not mentioned at least once by either Françoise or Jerry Fromm, Françoise's co-consultant, also from Austin Wakes, in these ongoing clinical meetings. And we also have recorded, almost by accident initially, all these events. So if you want to see them, you can on the YouTube channel that the Freud Museum provides. Now let me introduce Françoise to you. She is a prominent psychoanalyst in Paris, where she had worked for 40 years at the HSS, the Haute Études en Sciences Sociales, along with her husband and friend, Jean-Max Godelier, holding weekly seminars on madness and the social link. Françoise is the author of many articles and books, including History Beyond Trauma, Wittgenstein's Folly, Mother Folly, and Shandian Psychoanalysis. She is also one of the 2 clinical consultants of the series I just mentioned that we hold monthly. However, we are not only here to learn about the life and work of Dori Laub, but also about the workings of the video archive that was established at Yale University and which is now celebrating its anniversary. Amit Pinchevski will enlighten us about the complex nature of the digital nature underlying this interview process, created by Dori Laub and Laurel Vlock in the late 70s, illustrating the changing place of the third held by the camera during these emotionally powerful interviews. Amit Pinchevski is a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University. His research and publications focus on philosophy of communication, communication ethics, witnessing, and media and collective memory. He's the author of By Way of Interruptions, Levinas and the Ethics of Communication, and co-editor with Paul Frosch of Media Witnessing, Testimony in the Age of Mass Communications. And lastly, we also have the pleasure of being joined by Sonja Knopp, who thought she was here, but due to the strike in Germany, had to stay in Berlin. She's a PhD candidate in history at the Freie Universität Berlin. The working title of her dissertation thesis is History Without Memory, Video Testimony of Traumatized Holocaust Survivors and Their Meaning for the Historiography of the Persecution and Extermination of Romanian Bessarabian Jewry. Her research brought her to Yale University as a research fellow at the Genocide Studies program and to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Currently, she is a fellow of the Fondation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris. She has made it her task to examine the interlinkages between historiography and psychoanalysis and the question of how historiography can benefit from psychoanalysis. She identifies the survivor of the Holocaust as a history-stricken human being susceptible to attacks, vulnerable and mortal, reminding us that history is always a history of mortals. Please give the 3 a warm welcome.
Thank you, Jeanne, to explain what testimony is about. And also thank you to the Freud House Museum that is so important now at the present time. And also to Simon Wiesenthal Institute, and also to the Yale archives through Stephen. I will just start to tell you how I met Dori. It was in 2003. We just published, Jean-Max and I, a book out of our seminar, a weekly seminar at the École des Hautes Études, Institute of Social Science in Paris, which was entitled the book History Beyond Trauma, showing that during the periods of World War I, a lot of psychotherapists had invented another way to practice psychoanalysis with traumatized soldiers, and they were completely forgotten afterward. Their names were no more said. So when we started again, thanks to the museum and Monica and the team, we started the discussion, psychoanalysis under conditions of war with Ukrainian psychotherapist and psychoanalyst, and with Alexander and Jeanne Wolff, who is here. Right. They started that in June 2022, and Alexander insisted, although it lasts only a few sessions, although the analyst has to talk, to be very present, it's not behind on the couch, although he cannot be neutral, that's very important, it is psychoanalysis. And it was, again, this new paradigm of psychoanalysis, which is forgotten always during the time of peace. Just to tell you, I was in the Lacanian school during a long time, until Lacan's death. They talk a lot about psychosis, but they did not practice it. And the war was not at stake at all. History was not at stake at all. My Lacanian analyst never took attention that I was born in 43. My mother, I was in the womb of my mother while she was imprisoned under the Nazi. That was mentioned, that's all. So the new paradigm is to go and reach out what cannot be said. And that's what this wonderful film is. The first time I see the extension of Dori continuing intention not to reach out what cannot be said without any pressure. Why without? Because he is in it. He speaks about his own echoes in his life. So the people are not alone. And so it's very impressive. And also I want to thank you about you show also Johanna, who was always at his side when I knew him. So in 2004, we published that book first in America, another press, before it came out in France. And just after, a lady called me and said, Dori wants to talk to you. And I thought it was a woman, Dori. And I heard a deep voice, I want to meet you. And so as we used to go to a Henrik Center every summer since the 80s, because as I told you at the Lacanian school, there was nothing very useful to treat psychotics with psychoanalysis. And Jean-Max and I, although we were not psychologists nor psychiatrists, we were trained in classical literature and sociology. We started to work in public mental hospitals where we couldn't be sociologists. We had to talk. And the first hospital was on the battlegrounds of France since 1870, First World War, Third World War, and the patient spoke about the war to the person who could listen to that. So it was something familiar to us. And when Dori called us, so that's why we left every summer to Western Ridge, where they practiced since after the war, the psychoanalysis of psychosis. So for us, it was new. We learned the name of Frieda von Reichmann, who was a German analyst who created the psychoanalysis of psychosis in the 30s when she escaped the Nazi adjustment class. The names were unknown in France. So that we say to Dori, so we shall meet next summer at Western Ridge. And by chance, we met at Jerry Fromm's house. And Jerry Fromm is my co-discussant nowadays when we meet with the Ukrainian analysts. So we met, and I had brought my father, who was 100, in 2004, he was 90, because my mother had died. So we took him every time we came to the US. And while we were having some drink, getting to know each other, he was watching TV, although he did not understand English, he raised and fell. He was a little bloody, but we did not move quickly. Dori was on him first, quick, before we knew what was happening. And then he was talking to him. He did not speak French. My father did not speak English, but they managed to connect, and they became friends. And Dori always said, ask questions to your father. That's what I did. And I learned huge things, but I won't go in that. Because, of course, they keep silent. The war was silence. If you don't go and reach it out, and that's what orthodox psychoanalysis doesn't do. They wait. They are neutral. And of course, that's useful, but you cannot get to that silence region. So that's what testimony is about. For Dori, it is also a psychoanalytic approach. We saw a lot of videos, but there is something psychoanalytic, first in the video relationship with the camera, the man behind.
There may be a moment where we ask Amit. Then we'll come back to Dori.
Okay.
Because I think the video sort of almost taking the place of the psychoanalyst. I would love to hear from you what your thinking is. Also, I would love to hear whether you met Dori and what your impression was of him.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for the invitation, and I apologize for not being with you to watch Ohad's fantastic film, which is quite an achievement, I think. But as you can imagine, these are difficult times here in Israel, so it's not that easy to go and come back. But I'm still very happy that I'm able to say a few words here. I did, of course, know Dori and worked with him indirectly in the ways that I was interested in his project. And I would like to say a few words also connecting to Ohad and Micha's film, but speaking more generally about the question of audiovisual media in this project and in this idea of video testimony, which usually we call it testimony, but Jeffrey Hartman, who was the head of the Yale archive, was very strict about calling it video testimony, emphasizing the fact that it's a special kind of testimony. It's not a testimony or even a recording of a narrative, but it's an audiovisual recording. And if we just refer back to the film you've just seen, so the film, I think, adequately captures that, because the opening scene and the final scene are about the apparatus, right? About the archive, the video archive, what is normally being seen as behind the scene, as in the background. And if you were paying attention, you could see in one of the scenes where Dori is speaking to the witnesses, to survivors, and they ask him about if it's now rolling, if it's recording. So he says it's unimportant. It's unimportant. And this I think is a recurring fact, or a recurring point in him, in his work, because I often asked him about it, and he was quite, I would say, ambivalent about it, because he often took it as merely technical. There is a camera, there is a recording equipment and all that. And why is it that he was not, until much later, more conscious about the fact that there was really a new model here that had an important technological and media aspect to it? Well, maybe there is a whole Freudian point to it. I don't want to go into it, but something that is most obvious here is remained unacknowledged. And this is the fact that this encounter, this conversation, is not happening in the presence of two people, as often being portrayed, as as a listener, as a survivor, but is actually a triadic relation. It is taking place in the service of a future audience in front of a camera, and the camera represents the possibility, the promise perhaps, of future addressees, not of only the immediate one who enables the listening, an important role, no doubt, but also as a kind of a stand-in. The camera is a stand-in for a much larger audience in potential. And unlike a psychoanalytic session, which is done in confidence, right? It's secretive. Here, it's public from the very beginning. Perhaps that's the point of even having it. If it were only for two people, maybe some of the witnesses would not have even come to bear witness. It's that idea that this is being recorded and held for prosperity, basically. So it's going to be archived. It's recorded, archived, and disseminated under certain conditions. And I think this is really what was very novel at the point, the late 70s, where Dori Laub and Laurel Vlock came together to come up with this model. I think this is a very interesting cross between a psychoanalytic session, but also a television interview. It's neither, and it's both. It's not really a psychoanalytic session, but there is something about the approach. It's not simply a television interview, but Laurel Vlock, being a television producer, came with this idea of producing material that could serve educational purposes and documentary films and so forth. So this very interesting cross was also oriented towards the new media of the time, which was videotape and television. They were not thinking in terms of film. Film was already an established form or format, but required more production and editing, and could not be disseminated as easily. They thought, or rather mostly Laurel Vlock, how that could actually be used in the service of television. Television was the model, I think. And the other thing that is important to remember here is that video recording, video testimony served a very particular role here, which became very evident in the many, many texts that came after. For instance, in the book, which Shoshana fell on, but many others, that spoke about what Laub later on called the trauma signature. the way that trauma is registered through video testimony, through recording. If we were to imagine that such bearing witness would happen and re-recorded through a written text, or even a recorded audio recording, something would still be missing from it. And what would be missing, I think, is the fact that audiovisual recording can capture precisely all those instances, all those moments where bearing witness becomes impossible. It is the performance of the inability to bear witness, sometimes coming across in silences, in gestures, in halts, in slips of tongue, some, if you want to take it to a more Freudian path. But all those things that cannot be and would not be able to pass through a text, but can be captured by a technology that is recording unselectively. It's there and it's recording everything that goes on, all the slips, all the gestures, all the silences, the whole event of bearing witness. And that then allows the retroactive or retrospective discovery of all those moments and referring to them as such that might point to, suggest all those moments that speak to the unspeakable, that point to what cannot be borne witness to, the traumatic aspect. I think the medium and the way trauma has since come to be approached, understood as the inability to represent finds its way of expression in a very interesting way and necessary way in the form of video testimony. So I think these aspects of the recording, the archiving, the potential public dissemination, the triadic structure, but also the fact that video testimony captures the intentional and the unintentional expressions, the performance, the event, really captures in real time the flow, the flux of the narrative, the way it is being carried out, addressed. It also captures all those moments of the inexpressible through its expression. And if you would like, I can later address the later project with the
Can you hold off on this? Because that's
Sorry?
very interesting. The later, can you hold on to this for later?
Yeah, sure.
No
problem.
When
Okay.
you talk about the archive and the counter archive, because I would
sure.
also love to hear from Sonja Knopp, who I was not totally up to date on her accomplishments. She has finished her dissertation in 2023, and which has the title Zeugnisse erlittener Gewalt, so witnesses or testimonies of suffered violence. Yeah. Mrs. Knopp, Dr. Knopp, would you tell us what your reaction is to Mr. Pinchevski's portrayal of a video testimony? And then I want to come back to you because I want to find out what Dori said about what you said.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your input, Amit. Yeah, I was asking myself if I was just wondering when I was listening to you if I would agree or not on the visual part, because on the one hand, I think the face of the witness, which is central in the whole constellation of the video testimony, of course, is fundamental. But I think most, especially these traumatic moments of traumatic erasure, how Dori Laub called it, can be invisible, but also audible. So I didn't I would argue to investigate maybe how to analyze or interpret a video interview just with the tone. I don't know. I think video, of course, stresses the whole complex, but I'm not sure if I would agree with focusing on the video and I think the audio is at least equally important for the whole process. Especially if you focus on the voice and the different layers of voice and the connections with the human soul and so on.
The silence, maybe. The loud silences.
Yes.
Just to correct, I said audio visual. It's not
yes, of course,
just visual.
I heard
Absolutely,
that.
it's audio visual.
Maybe I misunderstood it. It's just sometimes I think that one of the difficulties of this video testimonies as a source is that the visual is very strong, and some other layers are getting lost sometimes. For me in my work, I was sometimes I was working just with the text, then I was working with the video and the text, or I was working just with the video without the text, or just working with the audio without the translation and without the. So I try to have different ways of access to this material, and I think it's complementary, of course. But on every layer and on every dimension of language that you find in these testimonies, this traumatic core, these gaps and silences and so on, seem to me very, I don't know the word like lähmend in German. It's like something heavy and something dark, which is very difficult to access. So I don't know if I answered the question. I prepared some other thoughts about methodological questions concerning the testimonies, but I will follow your lead, Jeanne.
Okay, because I would love to know whether Dori talked to you
Dori?
about the audio visual, and it's interesting you picked this up because there's a moment in the film, and we talked about that in the discussion today, where Dori said that it was important to see rather than to hear. So there seems to be a kind of complex dynamic between the two of them. And what also strikes me is we haven't yet talked about the body. You know, that is
the body language.
The body language and the body, because the only one who is in touch with the body is the interviewer. We as viewers of the audio tape can see it, but we can't smell it, we can't feel it, you know. But
we agree with Dori that we start with a situation where all mirrors have exploded. There is no representation. Only the body keeps the score, you know, but that there is no witness. And Dori's main, so be it visual, audio, and also sensorial, that you can. So Dori said always, we are passionate witness of events without a witness. And that this formula is available for what we do with the Ukrainian psychoanalysts, who are at their turn witnesses of with events without witness, and we are not supervision. We don't supervise, but we are witness of those witnesses who have no witness. And so this is very important because, as you said, both of you, a lot escapes only through words. And what is very important, I just will tell you a little story that the film, moved me so much. Because when he was, you put him in the wealth of the video, 4,000 and so on, and he was stunned. And he picked up some of them from Israel, from the psychiatric hospital in Israel. And he sent us, Jean-Marc and me, those videos. One struck me very much, and I tell you, because it was not blurred when I saw it. It was a chronic, we call them in French, chronic patient. You know, those who disappear behind the diagnosis. They are nobody anymore. They are annihilated. And so he had no teeth. He looked like the chronic people we saw in the asylum. He was chewing his absence of teeth. His face was deformed, and he was completely indifferent. He was looking elsewhere. And you had behind, you didn't see him, you had Dori's soft voice telling him relentlessly where he came from, what happened there in Germany. Well, I don't remember, Munich, I don't remember. Relentlessly, he was telling him his story, the place story, the names of the place, the names of the rivers, the geography of the place. And suddenly, the guy, look at him. That means he looks at the camera, but of course he looks to Dori behind. And his face becomes beautiful. It's amazing. He is a beautiful guy. He was an actor. He said what he was doing in Israel when he was escaped from the Holocaust with his parents. He became an actor. So he became the actor of his story. That's what happened. So it's not only the visual, it's not only the audio, it's the whole body who stands up. We say in French, recouvrer la face. How you say in
To recover your face.
Yeah, your honor.
Okay.
After you have been threatened with annihilation with the final solution, and then again in the hospital. That was what Dori was saying. He was a schizophrenic, okay? And so he starts to speak. He had been an actor, he had played Molière. I remember that because it's my favorite, he's my favorite actor, Molière, I love him. And such a revolution took place through that. So that's what I want to contribute. About the new media, of course, what you said, both of you, is very, very important, but at the condition that the video maker is not a neutral,
Doesn't take a neutral stance.
no,
Yeah.
because then he becomes a voyeur. And there has been a lot done this way. Oh, tell me about, give me testimony, and you are neutral, so you look at it. That's not.
Well, maybe that goes back, Mr. Pinchevski, to where I stopped you, because you have a very interesting point about the witnesses that may be false witnesses or not truthful witnesses, and what happens to them who use the act of speaking to Dori, maybe, as if I understood you correctly, as a way of making a play of it, of showing a very different side of themselves, and what happens to those videos. So there's this very, I think, important scene in the movie where Dori goes downstairs in the basement to show us all the videos that he said nobody had an interest in. Will you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Before I do, I just want to add that Dori, I think, put himself in the tradition of of an interesting case in 1946 of David Boder, who was an American psychologist, who went to Europe from the United States and audio recorded deportees across Europe, and made the first really recorded archive of their experiences. And I think one of some of that kind of intuition, I think, reflects and is really sustained in his project, which makes him, I think, of course, he was a therapist by profession, but his, I think, approach in the Testimony Project was a therapist of testimony rather than therapist of survivors or individual survivors. So he saw, I think, his task in rescuing, helping, affirming testimony rather than an individual. And this is, of course, a collective and social objective. Now, in terms of the later project that you were mentioning, so this project, I think Dori started at the beginning of the 2000s, and this project was specifically concerned with recording patients, Holocaust survivors, patients in Israel, which had not received any acknowledgement. But, and I think he collected something like 24, 25 testimonies during that time. And it was very difficult to get access, to get permission to record them. I mean, there was a lot of resistance in doing that. But he kept on doing that as much as he could. And then he also met resistance after recording the testimonies, finding an archive for them. Because they were not accepted as part of the broad category of Holocaust testimony. So what you had, in fact, I think, is a kind of a counter archive. What you saw is like the descent into the basement in which it was kept. It was a kind of a counter archive to the formal, legitimate archive, the Yale archive, which eventually received those testimonies, but at the time, nobody wanted to get involved in them. But I think it's not only a counter archive, but I think the testimony that comes out of this project is also a kind of counter testimony, because I was also fortunate enough to receive the recordings of those testimonies from Dori, who asked me to write about them. And watching them, it was very clear that these are unlike the ones that were done with the Yale project. Because with the Yale project, these are narratives, and these are complete stories of before, during, and after. And in many occasions, it's also of survival, of living, continue to live. Sometimes, new families, new life. What you had there in that project is ruined lives, mostly lives that were halted for decades. And in the testimonies themselves, sometimes most of the talking was done by Dori and his colleagues rather than by the survivors. They were very, very active in trying to get something out. Now, I was also very much touched by the specific testimony that you mentioned of Rafi Rakovsky, the actor, because I think this is a fascinating case. You saw in the film the first scene, and also that goes on, that's the scene where Dori, one of his first interviewees in the late 70s was Menachem Stern, who was also a child survivor, but a doctor and a lieutenant, not a lieutenant, sorry, a lieutenant general. And, he went on to be a very kind of, impressive person. But I think Dori and him had some affinity, both being child survivors. Rakovsky's the same, but a very different model, also a child survivor who hid at a monastery and then became an actor. And the story goes, there's no hint of it in the testimony, but later on I was able to discover the story is that he was assigned a role, a secondary role in one of the first shows in the 1960s in Israel, playing the role of Pope Pius. In Rolf Hochhaus played the deputy.
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
C'est une pièce de théâtre by Hochhut, a German author about the Pope, the 12th, who's
And he was
and he was playing the Pope himself, right?
Yeah, he was playing the Pope himself, of course, being saved at the monastery, and the evening when they had to the grand opening, he collapsed and was hospitalized since. I mean, it's an incredible story. And of course, it doesn't come up in the testimony. You had to know it. And Dori did not know it at the time. I told him something about it later on. He knew something later on. And the whole, when you watch the testimony, then you come, with all this knowledge, you kind of think to yourself, well, how much of it is acting? Is it the actor still acting in the testimony? How much of it, is it important that he's still acting? That he's considering himself as an actor?
Why not?
What of it is acting? Not acting in the sense that, of being dishonest, but as a position that it maintains, and Dori allows him to maintain. Basically, he's not confronting him with anything. He allows him to play the role, and I think this is a very interesting situation in which Dori is between these two extreme models of Stern, right, the doctor and the general Menachem, and on the other hand, Rakovsky, who is in the mental institution for the rest of his life until his death, basically, and never recovered. But both child survivors ending up in a very different paths of lives following the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But Dori says that I don't know if it was to me or somewhere else, that sometimes the one-shot video testimony, one session, will continue by phone calls, and that was not possible with this man because he was confined. But he also always keeps the opening for a process, elaborating what has started during the video conference. And he says he was always ahead of the patient. The patient was always asking the patient, not the patient at the first, the survivor, who are you? So that I can talk to you. And he was constantly tested. And so afterward, he would go ahead and wait for the person to join him. And that is something that I experience always with people who are in the state of asylum. It takes time, it takes a long time afterward. It's not one shot.
But I think nonetheless, the idea, and I have to admit, when I read your article, I thought, why hadn't I thought about this? The idea that there could also be a false witness, that witnessing we've always linked to uncovering some truth or getting to something that has never been expressed. And so I think that this actor, Rakovsky, I think brings into, opens up the possibility that there are also, some witnesses, since before we even introduced this term into psychoanalysis, it was strictly a judicial term, that we allow the thought that some of these witnesses can also make a fool of us, or because you also said that he said, oh, nothing happened to me. So I want to bring that question also to Sonja Knopp. I wonder whether that is also something you've thought about, the idea of that one could introduce some tale that is part, I thought you were also going to say, that is part of his psychotic structure, and that was a solution to the trauma.
I don't speak about psychotic structure.
Oh, psychosis. I'm sorry.
I don't like that word. Because
Psychosis.
it's static.
Yes.
I always
Yeah.
speak about
That
the-
I forgot. That's
But
too
you
Lacanian.
can cheat, you can
Yeah.
play, you
Right.
can act,
Exactly.
but you test the other.
Yeah.
And Dori is immensely involved.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
we saw in the film when he said, I don't want to make them suffer more.
Yeah.
So it's a compromise between let them express the way they can, not they want. They can, and up to a point, it can change. It's a dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dr. Knopp.
Yeah, this is a very sensitive topic, because, well, historians, lots of historians are very skeptical towards witnesses, and they have kind of a ambivalent situation with each other, I would say, because sometimes some historians are kind of afraid, I think, of witnesses because they have their own story, and it's not about true or not true. And a lot of historians not just in Germany, but especially in Germany, for a very long time after the Second World War, insisted in not working with testimonies of survivors or persecuted persons, because the argument was very prominently represented by Martin Brojat, for example, from the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich these days, not these days, but back then. He argued with Saul Friedländer, who integrated the voices of the persecuted, and German historians said, no, it's too subjective. It's not, you can't work with this because you can't be sure that they are not lying or that there are no false memories and so on. And there are some there are some examples where people invented a story, but I think one or two, which I know, it's something which is much, from my point of view, which is much overrated if you compare it to the hundreds of thousands of testimonies what we have today of Holocaust survivors, and especially or particularly looking at the video interviews of from the psychiatric institutions in Israel, and I just focused on one of them for more than 10 years. It's I never thought that he is lying or doing constructions of a story, because he was not telling a story at all. He was not telling, he was not presenting, or it was like Amit said before, most of the time Dori was speaking, and he was speaking, of course, but they both were kind of complementary double speakers, I would say, in some parts. Sometimes they were ambivalent, and sometimes they were contrary, and there were very different moods and dynamics in the interview. But at no point of this 2.5 hour interview, I would say that the witness was making something up, because the main idea that came to me when I first saw the interview, and not just in the beginning, it came back again and again, is that he said nothing special happened. He said this, nothing special happened. So in alterations, I would say. So it's the opposite. It's not that I had to be careful that he was lying, maybe, or making a false construction. But the difficulty was to listen to to a muted voice, listen to the spaces between fragmented pieces of a story. Yeah, this is another methodological problem, but the basis of the problem, because historians here have to speak about something that was not allowed to speak about for a long time, and nobody wanted to listen to it as well. And I recognized this in my research as well. It was not always not always easy to talk about this material in colloquia or somewhere else, because it's a very precarious material in the way that the speakers are, or the witness is in a mental institution and is very old after the actual events, and is recalling from his memory, which is disturbed on top. So, and the trauma term in cultural sciences is already discussed in a very broad way, and a lot of people, of course, and they have good reasons, some of them are very critical towards this trauma term as well. So,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, about historians. When Jean-Marc died in 1915, 2015, I stopped our seminar for 2 years, and the participants were not happy. So in order to stay in that institute, they asked an historian to greet them. So it was a mixture with psycho something and young historian. His name is Stéphane Audouin-Rousseau. He's the historian of First World War. And around him are young historians of sensibility. And so he called that seminar the transmission of war. And the transmission of war, of course, la guerre transmise, of course, includes testimony. And they have to not complement, but to have two modes, like to art. The art of history with objective fact, and the art of telling stories, which can be epic, which can be, different. And recently, I think about this house, when Daniela said that there were 73 Jewish people who were
In the
Samel. Comment on dit? Samel, ça veut dire quoi?
Yeah,
Rassemblé.
collectionné.
Oui. Last week, I received a book by a historian, also of First World War and Second, Annette Becker, another of that generation, she's my age, a little younger, called The Jews Betrayed by Their France, by their own country, which is made out of testimonies, of correspondence, and the historian is there at their service, à leur service.
Yeah, at their service.
And it's amazing how history is changing,
Yes.
because of that. And she speaks of places like here, where in France, people were concentrated, but the word was said, but disappeared. How we had a lot of concentration camps, little, small, which disappeared. They were called like that. So through the people who are there in the correspondence at the beginning, they hope they are not bad, or they don't have to eat, but it will be better next day. They are in illusion. Like you say, they don't suffer at first. At the end, you find them completely deprived of everything. And I learned by the same way by her that I was in the womb of my mother in a concentration camp, which is called Compiègne. I learned that very, very late, where all the trains went to Auschwitz, and it was the worst place to be. Until then, we thought it was just, a place where people were, like a prison. So you see, all those testimonies give now new, we could say, views by the body of the people, what they went through. So historians are not so narrow-minded as many psychoanalysts do. They change with that practice of testimonies.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, I totally agree. It changed, but yeah, when I started with this work in 2000 and was looking for an advisor for my doctoral thesis, I got an answer of a very prominent professor who said everything has been said concerning video testimonies in 2007 or 2008 and 9 later. So it's ambivalent right now. We have a new generation of historians. Of course, it's not as it was, but I mean this discussion between Bourgeat and Breitländer, it was the 1980s. Of course, it took a long time.
Breitländer and who?
Between
Bourgeat, Martin Bourgeat. I don't know. Maybe I don't spell it right.
Okay.
It was the director of the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich. Back then.
Breitländer, I don't know, right? Yeah. But what you maybe another question that occurs to me is because you were all talking about the different styles of Dori Laub when he spoke to the survivors, and you were saying with this actor how he was insisting in mentioning and asking him about the places and the addresses, and was also almost speaking more for the survivor than listening to him, even though he emphasizes many times that he wouldn't ask questions and would just listen with some, and I would think the more disturbed ones that you're describing, where there are maybe not even words or their language is very punctured. I have a sense, Dori supplies through, and here I'm becoming, and I may for a moment become quite psychoanalytic, he uses his counter-transference, things that the survivor elicits in him, makes him feel or makes him think of, as a way to provide a kind of meaning that the survivor or the patient has lost. And that's very similar to current psychoanalytic treatment of psychosis, which was never thought to be possible with Freud and until the 60s or 70s, that psychoanalysis even took in as patients, very disturbed patients. That's one thing, but it's also, and this is often a text forgotten by Freud, it's also very much of what Freud suggested at the very end of his life. We always talk about interpretation and interpretation of bungled actions or dreams or slip of the tongue, but he also wrote a very important paper called Construction at the end in 1936 or so, in which he puts the pieces together of what he thinks might have happened to a patient and presents that as a possibility to see what the patient does with it. He doesn't say this is what happened, but he supplies a possibility out of the fragments from the patient and delivers that to the patient, and then one can see what the patient does with it. So I think that they're very different styles depending on how disturbed the patient, or in this case, how traumatized the survivor is, and so I think it's eliciting very different ways of being.
Yeah, just a little long psychoanalysis. It's to address the part which are inaccessible. So it's not counter transfer. You don't count. It's transfer, interference. It's not counter. It's interference between the two stories, so that you can give a first mirror. And so, and again, I should say something here because I am in the house of Freud. I think he was wrong when he spoke about the return of the repressed. Because when he was in 1907 in the Gradiva and in the uncanny after the war, he said, all the unconscious is repressed, but wait a minute, no, with the other way around. All the repressed is unconscious, but all the unconscious is not repressed. That means there is another kind of unconscious which is not articulated, symbolized, and so on, because there is no other. And this unconscious is what you get in the videos. The face, the impression, the change of the tone of voice, a lot of which is not articulated in a narrative because there is no other. But when the other mirrors or interferes, then this unrepressed unconscious starts to be, Dori says, start to inscribe a history which has never been inscribed. There is no history. It's history in the making. It's completely new. It's the start. And Jean-Max and I, we used to say, it's the start of a political subject. A subject erases, emerges, for on traces which have been erased. So it's really very strong, and that's what he's doing. And of course, sometimes you fail, very often. It's like the translation from me. I love that. Sometimes you fail, sometimes you succeed. It's always fluctuating. But that's what Freud, and I insist on that, because the return of the repressed, that's what he says in the Moses at the end. Although he says also the unconscious is not repressed. In the same text, he comes back to that, to the fact that it's no more a matter of sexual repressed desires, but a subject of erased history, like Akhenaton wiped out civilization. He writes that when psychoanalysis is on the verge to be destroyed by Goering, or Goebbels, I don't know which
Goering.
one. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry.
Amit, do you have your reaction to this?
Yeah, you said different styles in the way that Dori approached in these two projects. Actually, I don't, in this sense, I don't think there are two styles. I think it's the same approach. And the same approach has to do with the fact that, and that has nothing to do, I think, with the pathological state of the survivor, if there is one, even a pathological state. I think it has to do with the fact that testimony inherently cannot be reduced to a discourse of truth or falsehood.
Yeah.
It operates with respect to a truth of what happened, but it's not strictly factual. And there could be, of course, moments in the testimony that the testimony is historically incorrect, right? Something, and I'm leaving aside the mental, the psychoanalytical explanations of why there is such, a mishap. But people tell the story in the way that they remember it, and that is the truth of the story. It's not necessarily the historical truth. And this is, I think, an approach that Dori held regardless of who was the survivor. He was acknowledging the fact that what is being said is believed to be truth by the one bearing witness.
Exactly.
So that fundamental acknowledgement, I think, was the key. And it is an acknowledgement that carries through also the mediated form of the testimony. And when it comes into the discussion with historians, of course, there is incommensurability, because historians want to see if that correlates with facts. Some want to use it in different ways, like Saul Friedlander, for instance, that wanted to give different aspects of the history as it was experienced, as it was felt, rather than as the report of occurrences. I think Dori would have even taken it a step further, and I think he says something to that extent in the film, that this is a different historical account. It's a history, but it's not a history in the sense of an event. It's a history of an experience.
Exactly.
This is how the event were experienced, and experienced in retrospect, because it's not as they were experienced in the moment, it's how they're being remembered and testified in the present when it comes to the past. So they're twice removed in a way, but that, I think, has to do with his attempt, not only his, others as well, to constitute a different discourse about the past, one that is not committed solely to the factual discourse and the historical discourse, but one that is more, I would say, flexible and accommodating to the experience of the past. And that, of course, can get you into a lot of trouble, because it's not verifiable.
Okay. We soon should also open it to the public, but
Just I want to say a little
go ahead.
thing about the past. When you go back to that past, you see that on the videos, on the film. This past at some point is present. They are in it, in the present. It's a frozen time. So you can see that very well in the film. They are there, and he has to come there so that they are not alone there. So, as you say, it can be flexible, but that's some charts, you say, which
Splinters chart,
which are
pieces
of
of
time,
memory.
which are timeless time. That's just a little.
Well, and I was thinking also of Nachträglichkeit, of après coup, you know, that you know, you never remember the past as it was. Freud says early on, you only remember how you related to the past. So of course, your present is constantly rewritten through the passage of time.
Before we finish, I just want to. Any question?
No, we should, or if you want to.
Yeah, just, Dori came to our seminar twice or three times. One in 2008, he spoke and so on, and in Paris, and by pure chance, perhaps 6 months or quite a lot of time after, 3 members of that seminar who did not connect to each other, started to translate his articles from the English. They came independently, so that I helped them, because they were not so fluent, me neither. But and they are there. They are the first published in French. I am very. It's called In Clinique de l'Extrême, clinical experience of the extreme. So those are the 3 and I gave an introduction, and there are 2 more, one about art and trauma, and the other about the perpetrators in that, and another interview I gave with Dori beforehand. So I give it to the Freud Museum.
Thank you.
Oh, man.
Are there, maybe it's time to open the questions to the audience? Are there questions that you or comments you want to make, either to Françoise or to Pinchevski and Knopp via Zoom? Yes.
He's the microphone so that our Zoom gets.
I was wondering if, I don't know, anyone on this panel can talk about the presence not only of the horrific trauma, but the fact that these people, most of them, I guess, are no longer alive, and what the space of their death is and how to think about that. And what that means for this medium that now is what we have of these people's lives once they're gone. Thank you.
Anybody wants to take this up?
First, there are not only the people who went through Holocaust, there are their descendants who are also interviewed, who are still, there is a transmission. But what is the relationship of the descendants with the archives is a good question. I don't know. Do you know?
I didn't get it full acoustically. Maybe you could repeat the question for me.
I was wondering how to think, whether any of you have thought about the what it means to be looking at a video of someone who's no longer alive.
Maybe Stephen, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think if I can comment about a point on that. I think the disappearance of the survivors is already inscribed in the testimony itself. This is the goal of it. This is the point of it, that they should be survived by their testimonies. And I think there is a kind of an oath there that once it's there, once they've given their testimony, once it has been borne witness to, and it's recorded, and it's kept, and then it would be disseminated, and it would be then remembered, there is an afterlife to that testimony. And in that respect, the fact that they're alive or not alive is secondary, because they're survived by their testimony. I think there is a kind of hopefulness in that project that it wanted to constitute a collective community of remembering that bears witness to the testimonies after the death of the survivors.
But that implies that these media are eternal, and that interest is persistent. And isn't there a kind of mortality of the medium and a mortality of the interest?
Okay, that's a different and interesting question, whether that the format and the media in which that was done is keeping up with the times. And this is a very acute question. I have a whole I've written a book that tries to deal with that, and for instance, with recent projects that try to work against this logic. For instance, interviewing survivors and then recording their testimonies in order to produce an algorithm. And
An algorithm
and a way to converse with the testimonies after their death, and to project their image as a holographically, so as if they are in the room. So that is a very different approach, one that does not seek to listen to a story, but wants to intervene in the story, to recreate it every time anew. This is an ongoing project in the United States. So I think every time, every generation is trying to use the newest media in order to use it in order to serve the commemoration. And it has its own challenges every time. It only goes to show, I think, that the interest is there, but there are changes that are both technological and social and cultural in different ways. And although they, I would say the key initiative or commitment is there, it takes very different forms right now.
Alexander, what's the next one?
Thank you very much. I know that Françoise, like some unexpected question or maybe uncomfortable question. I have one. I have two. The one of them is, what do you think, or maybe they call it in the discussion, what do you think, what can be the motivation to become a witness? Because it has some, it must have some, I think, some very special dynamic and motivation to be a witness. Because not all people want to be a witness. And that as a parallel, as I say, to the discussion, I am a psychiatrist, and when I speak with the patient with the bad psychosis, if we say bad schizophrenic prognosis, but a young man. And when I speak with him, I speak in two positions. The one, my position is to a witness position, because I am a witness of the catastrophe of this patient. And the patient telling me the story of the catastrophe. And on another position, I am a physician, I am a psychiatrist. What is the motivation? What is the position in the witnessing?
Yeah.
It is for me the very interesting question. If I ask, understandable, I thought,
Yeah, you can.
Yeah,
I mean, I think everybody can.
It's a resistance position against the ruthless agency for whom the other does not exist at whatever scale. Can be an abused child, can be a young schizophrenic. There is always behind that somebody crushed by what I call this ruthless agency, which objectifies people, reifies people. Is that an answer for you? Okay.
Do you have some thoughts about that? I have to look in here. Who wants to be a witness? What does it take to want to be a witness? I think is the question.
Well, I'm not sure about how to answer the question of motivation here, because I think it's a very difficult and complex question. In some cases, I think they had to persuade people to come and to interview. It wasn't their motivation. It's not they were looking for someone, and there was this project that they finally came and gave their testimony. For some, it was decades of silence that they had to be persuaded to give the testimony and be recorded. So it's very difficult to answer the question of motivation here. But in retrospect, perhaps there was I think a realization that in that process of both being listened to by the interviewer and being recorded by a camera and an archive, basically having that potential of being heard further in the future, I think was I would say maybe rehabilitation of an acknowledgement of their suffering, one that they did not have during the event and following, and then they received that recognition belatedly by the event of being listened to and recorded. So yeah. I'm not sure many of them expected that to be the result, or certainly not the motivation that they came with. So our motivation is to be acknowledged or to be recognized. But I think that might have been the result after the fact.
Mm-hmm. I have a to go in your direction. Just a little sentence of Dori. I love it. This sentence. I will be there in the very moment you lose me. I am your witness. Which is paradoxical. I am there in spite of the fact that you may reject me, that you may go through back through moments of, and I like that. That's why I share it.
I'd like to add that in at least one case of the video testimonies from the Israeli psychiatric institutions, the person came to Dori himself. He was not asked. He was in the second group, in the control group. The study made a difference between the first group of interviewees and the second group of interviewees 6 months later. And there was one patient, he just confronted Dori when he was in the building and said, I want to give I want to testify. So the motivation could be very strong. And this was a person who tried to talk. If you look at the clinical records, obviously, or from what the doctor said, he tried to talk in the beginning when he was hospitalized in the 1950s, and then there's a big gap. And then in 2003, in this case, Dori Laub came into the building, and he tried to talk. It was very difficult, but the motivation was on his own.
So I think listening to all of you and thinking about sort of the traditional historical point of view, then this new historical point of view, or the clinical point of view, and now a potential AI reanimation of the witnesses. One of the questions that comes to me is, what is the ontology of the event? You know, what is it that we are in fact talking about? The traditional historical view is that the event exists out there basically separate from all witnesses. You know, that it has some kind of consistency in and of itself. Then we have the notion that, you know, people's experiences, the subjective part of it is in fact part of history. And then there's a notion that we can use an algorithm to reconstruct what people might say but cannot say. And it seems to me that, you know, we start what seemed like a solid event, and I'm not denying that the event exists, but how we think about the status of the event starts to change as we move through all these media. You know, it's no longer something that's like a fact of physics. You know, the facts are not speaking for themselves as traditional history would tell you it should, but instead it becomes inseparable from the kind of discourses that are that bring it to life, that bring it into the present as an event of the past.
Yeah, of course the emphasis on the event now is also a reaction to psychoanalytical approach where there is no event, only projections, only projections, only fantasies. And that was Freud's problem when in 1897 he said all abuses are fantasies. So there is a recurring of the event as a traumatic event, but what is trauma? It's a wounded relationship. So it's no more, it's the event is there, but it's the relationship with the event, which is on the testimony focus. It's a relationship, but the events exist, but the relationship can differ. Is it okay? I don't know what I say.
If you
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Wanna go? No.
No, go ahead.
I think this traditional historical perspective is more, sounds to me more like the perspective of a chronicle, somebody who is like in the ancient times, just writing down a number of events from one single perspective, which is objectivated, but is still one single objective. So our approach that we have today from the historical sciences is it's more complicated, and there's never only one perspective. So yeah, well, I won't go into this chapter too deep, but just one remark, because we speak about genocidal violence, and the history of genocide is yeah, well, we there seems to be a pattern, no matter what genocide you look at. And the last step of a genocide is to erase the memory of it. And if you consider this part of genocidal actions, the testimonies and the remembered reality of the people testifying is a factual level, if you want to call it this way, of history. So, but in the end, I would always stress that history, of course, has a function of orientation for societies, and as societies are always changing and discussing, history does as well. So this old idea of traditional history in comparison to other forms of history or so, it doesn't work anymore. I'm not sure if it ever worked. It is kind of an invention of the beginning of the 20th century, when all the sciences, the natural sciences, became so strong that the historians tried to be one of these sciences as well, and started to stress their objectivity skills. But in the end, it's always interpretation, and it's always critical hermeneutic interpretation of sources. We never know for sure what exactly happened.
Thank you. Monica, you wanted to say?
So we have actually a question here.
Sorry.
Yeah, my question would actually connect to your answer now, Dr. Knopp, and to going back to the motivation, because you talked about the genocide that erases memory. And so I was thinking about the movie that really makes this place of the archive very central, and the materiality of this videotapes. And so one motivation that came up in the interviews that we saw in the movie was to have this interview also in a material form. Like, people said that they cannot talk to their children about that. And then at the end, they get this videotape and they have it in hands, and they can give it to their children without having to tell it again. So I think one of these motivations is also this, having this object, and for the transmission to the future generation.
If I just can say something very quickly, I think sometimes the motivation is also the death, you know, the knowledge that these survivors don't have many more years to live. And so it is something that I think they're quite motivated eventually to put into words and to pass it on to their younger generations.
Yeah, and I think it was already mentioned in other words, but bringing it out, the story, if it is for the first time or the second, or I don't know what, bringing it out and on a videotape or another material or another medium is healing on the one hand, and yeah, it seems to be an answer to an inner urge, to be verified.
Inner urge.
From an outside something, a person, or just a VHS cassette. I'm not sure if I was clear. It's just this this need to be to hear. I hear what you say, and I believe you. So something outside of the person who is verifying what he or she has said. So I think the videotape or other forms, and when you can see it on a screen, it's something. I mean, you're a psychoanalyst, and most of you probably know.
But something to hold on to, right? Something to hold on to. It's one
strongest
yeah
motivation to have it out of yourself somehow.
Mm-hmm. Monica.
I think the most important thoughts I had already mentioned. So first, thank you very much for all your various and interesting inputs. And I think from my point of view as running the Freud Museum, that we learned is a special place with emptiness, and also witnessing the fates of Freud's Jewish neighbors who were murdered in Nazi concentration camps and so on and so forth. Besides presenting Freud as the father of psychoanalysis and the place itself as the origin of psychoanalysis. So for me as an art historian, and also referring to what you said about character and the use of the news media. First, I think it's what I'm so grateful about the videos is because they are an instrument, a communication instrument, and it's in a new format, but it's like sitting around a fire and listen to the experiences of the oldest, and they are not between us anymore. And that should help to deal with our current situation. And also the film you make and the link you did with the current genocide and war, Ukraine, Palestine and Israel, and all these awful disasters we are confronted with. We have to have something that gives us an orientation or a way, not only to deal with it, with the cruelty that happens to the individual people, and to respect that and to listen to it and to hear it. That's the clinical point of view. But to develop some hope for our future. And that's the task of our institution, and I think that's really the main task. So all the reality and the truth that is told by the body, and the face and the mimicry and the words, and all in the combination, we get such an enormous knowledge we would not get only through the words, not only through the body, language, and so on and so forth. So it's a wonderful format to tell a story and a narrative that can help to handle our present and the future. And I think that's the main task of this media and the videos, and should be also the motivation for us to improve our human cultures. And it's the same what Freud always said. Yeah, it depends on the development of the civilization of the human culture.
I had the impression a while ago that Ohad, you wanted to say something? Or was that a mistaken impression?
I wanted to ask about the role of video recording afterwards, but I think there were quite, not quite, there were fascinating remarks here. I recall that once I came to Yale there was a symposium in the memory of Dori Laub 2018, and there was a survivor. She came all the way from Florida with a tape, and she waved with it, and she said, "Dori made me into a movie star." And I thought, but this scene wasn't recorded. We weren't allowed to film.
Oui, j'ai compris, mais c'est
Anyhow.
sorti à l'une d'elles en lui accrochant.
That's motivation.
Yeah, so, but I heard the remarks here. It's very interesting. Also, what you said about giving it to the family, not only to the archive, but back to the family, to the children. I have a good friend that the Spielberg's video of his mother is back there in the cupboard, and they're waiting for the day that they will have the courage to look. And
Wow,
so
yeah.
I have only questions about it, and there were very interesting remarks. Thanks.
So it's an ongoing presence, right?
Yeah.
An ongoing presence that's there,
Out of
sometimes
our
hidden.
sense.
Yeah, so yeah.
I wonder if people really look, because, Jeffrey, thanks, I'm just thinking about the chapter in, Jews Gone on Videotape by Jeffrey Chandler about wedding videos and bar mitzvah videos. And he believes that these are almost never looked at again. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of fantasy of what will happen with this that is not often actualized.
You have to edit it to make a short version.
Yeah.
The bar mitzvah video.
So as someone who has a bar mitzvah video, I can tell you that it has been watched. Yeah, maybe I'm the exception, but I will say, yes, it's not a fantasy. So, and I actually I have empirical proof that it's not a fantasy. Because I work in an archive that exclusively provides access to these testimonies to the children and grandchildren all the time. 90% of the emails or reference questions that I get are, my grandmother gave testimony, my father gave testimony, I don't know. How do I access the testimony? Because a videotape as tangible object, as Amit will clearly attest to, doesn't make sense when there aren't any VHS machines anymore. So then that's been our role to sort of try to bring the older media into new forms and to keep it alive as a kind of living memorial. So yes, it's not just a fantasy, but of course, one size does not, I can't speak for him, I can't make generalizations, but my sense is that it is being watched and it is being, there's an interest in generation after generation, great grandchildren now approaching us and wanting to view testimonies. I will say though that one of the things in terms of the changing media, which you were asking about, like now we're talking about AI and sort of new dimensions in testimony from USC Shoah Foundation. One of the things that I find compelling about just good old plain simple video testimony, which we've seen, is that it has a beginning and it has an end. Right? And with these AI sort of approaches, there doesn't seem to really be a beginning or an end here. And something about that is disconcerting to me and feels inauthentic. I mean, I know authenticity is a very complicated topic, but there's something that a subject or term, but it feels like, it doesn't feel like testimony to me in the same sense. And it feels like a manipulation. I suspect that the motivation behind this new technology is a sense of moral panic at the loss of the living witness. That we, or not all of us, but many of us, are afraid that without the living witness, somehow the history will no longer be able to prove that this actually occurred. But of course, the counter argument would be that we have this enormous amount of video testimony, which we can refer to again and again and again. And like Dori said, he watched his mother's testimony 10 times and see something new each time, right? So we can mine and watch and learn from this archive. And this is the best substitute for the living witness, not some AI model, I would suggest.
Well, with AI, there are no more boundaries, right? It can go on endlessly. And I think that's what, you know, the loss as a topic, absence as a topic is becoming less and less possible, because you can endlessly substitute things, you can endlessly make them happen. And I think that's what you're missing with the AI. I mean, you can soon, if I understand this correctly, go and have a conversation with the very person you lost, an imagined conversation. So there's a lot of jouissance also involved in that, if I may use that term, in not having to recognize that there is an end, that there is a loss.
And I do think that as we talk about motivations for giving testimony, and one of them, of course, is you're absolutely correct, this idea of this thing that I can give to my children, we hear it again and again in the survivors. Even in your film, you showed a few clips where, do I get a tape of this? Do I get a tape of this? This motivation is key, but also there's a motivation of recognition, right? Like someone did mention recognition. It's almost like compensation in a way, right? Someone listening to your story and believing you, and being there as a witness to the witness, right? That's recognition. And that is something extremely valuable as a motivation. There was also another question about the motivation of the witness. Not everyone wants to be a witness, and that's a really important thing. And I don't think any of us have really touched on that. We mentioned voter. Someone mentioned voter, Amit, I think. But even voter recognizes that we have to keep in mind that these are the anomalies, right? The survivors, the witnesses are the anomalies. One of the topics of the title is absence, right? The absence is the most prevalent absence in all of this, is the fact that we only have this tiny anomaly of survivors and a subset of the survivors who are willing to give testimony. So every account we have is going to be fragmentary by its nature, because like voter, we cannot interview the dead.
Are there any more questions? Because if they're not, then I wanted to say something at the end that you've made me think of, Monica. It's not a videotape, but I think the films that exist here in the museum, the Heimatfilme, the home films of Freud, as he's celebrating his, I think, 80th birthday or 70th birthday, the voice and the pictures of Anna Freud, the kids that come to congratulate him, it is no longer at the center as it one was, but it's still there and it survives. And I think it's a very special part in its own room in this museum, and it has been here as long as I've come to the museum. I think it's a very live testimony to this man's life. So I want to thank you, Françoise. I want to thank Dr. Knopp and Dr. Pinchevski, and thank you for organizing this. Really, I think couldn't have come at a better time.
Thank you.